The room was glowing with chandeliers, the tables covered in white linens and wine glasses polished to perfection. It was Sophia's big day, the wedding reception my dad had been bragging about for months. He stood up with a glass of Cabernet, his voice booming over the sound of silverware and polite chatter. "Friends and family," he said, smiling like a politician on campaign night, "let's raise a toast to my daughter Sophia and her new husband, Major Daniel Brooks, a Marine who actually knows what real service looks like." The crowd turned their attention to him, eager for whatever speech he was about to deliver. Daniel sat at the head table in his dress blues, straight posture, the kind of man my dad had always wanted me to marry or, better yet, become. My dad's grin widened. This young man storms battlefields with courage, just like his uncle in Desert Storm. That's real grit. Polite applause rippled across the hall. I stayed seated in the corner, black dress blending into the shadows. I twisted my napkin tighter, bracing myself, because I knew what was coming. I knew that tone praise for one child, humiliation for the other. "And now," Dad continued, pretending to sigh heavily, "a word about my other daughter." He gestured toward me like I was some afterthought on the program. "Rebecca's got some job with the Marines, probably shuffling emails or making coffee." Laughter broke out at a few tables. Not roaring, just those smug chuckles people share when they think they're in on the joke. I kept my head down, jaw locked. Sophia caught my eye from across the hall. In her designer gown and flawless makeup, she mouthed, "I'm sorry." Of course, she didn't stop Dad. She never did. The humiliation rolled on. "Truth is," Dad said, his voice dripping with pity, "Rebecca tried for officer training years ago but couldn't hack it. We hoped she'd soar, but she washed out. At least she's got steady work now, even if it's not what we dreamed." My uncle leaned toward his wife, stage whispering loud enough for half the table to hear. "Didn't she fail out of OCS?" Dad gave a solemn nod. "Yep, couldn't handle the grind." More chuckles, more shaking heads. A cousin snickered into her wine glass. I sat there, back straight, like I was strapped into a cockpit under enemy fire. Except this wasn't Iraq or Afghanistan, this was worse. This was my own family, and their battlefield was a wedding reception. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at me from the head table. His jaw tightened, like he wasn't sure if he should intervene. I avoided his eyes. I wasn't about to show weakness here. Dad raised his glass high. "So here's to Sophia and Daniel, and to the honor of true Marine grit." The guests clinked glasses, smiles wide, none of them questioning the cruelty. The sound of crystal meeting crystal echoed across the room while I sat motionless, face hot, hands trembling just enough that I kept them under the table. That moment, with all the laughter and smug nods circling the room, burned into me sharper than anything I'd faced in uniform. You'd think dodging mortar fire would be worse, but it's amazing how a father's words can cut deeper than shrapnel. And this is where I'll pause to ask you something simple. If you've ever sat in a room full of people smiling while you were the punchline, you know that sting. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, I'd love to know. And if you want more family revenge stories and military stories like this one, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next turn in this wild ride. Back in that reception hall, I was already deciding whether to walk out or stay put. Leaving would have been easy, but the sting of Dad's voice had locked me to that chair. I watched Sophia beam as guests congratulated her, Daniel trying to smile politely while his father-in-law carried on like a king. No one looked my way, and honestly, that was almost worse than their laughter. Being invisible in your own family is a special kind of punishment. But then Daniel's eyes caught mine again, steady, searching, like he knew something everyone else didn't. He didn't laugh, he didn't smirk, he just studied me with a look I couldn't quite place. And that was the first sign the evening wasn't going to play out the way my dad expected. My fingers dug into the napkin until the fabric twisted tight, the sound of laughter still hanging in the air. It wasn't just tonight. Those laughs had an echo. They carried the same sting I'd grown up with. I was 12 the first time my dad told me straight out that the Marines weren't for me. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a beer, bragging to my uncles about how Sophia would be a star one day, college, sorority, perfect marriage, the works. When I said I wanted to apply to the Citadel, he barked a laugh and waved me off. The Marines are for men, Rebecca, you wouldn't last a week. Sophia leaned against the fridge, arms crossed, smiling like she was in on the joke. Yeah, she added, you'd probably quit before the first run. She was 16, and even then she knew exactly how to twist the knife. That became the script of our family. Sophia was the pretty one, the graceful one, the one Dad paraded at church events and dinner parties. I was the stubborn tomboy who never measured up. The more I pushed, the harder they laughed. At 17, when I filled out my OCS application, Sophia announced it to a group of her friends like it was comedy night. Can you believe my sister thinks she can hack Marine officer training? She can't even carry a grocery bag without complaining. They giggled, and I walked out, pretending not to hear. But I did hear, I always heard. The memories didn't fade when I put on a uniform. They were stitched into it. Even when I earned my first qualification flights, Dad shrugged. It's paperwork with wings, she's not on the front lines. Sophia nodded, always the sidekick in his one-man show. At that wedding reception, surrounded by people grinning at my expense, it was like every old scar had been ripped open at once. I could practically hear teenage Sophia mocking me in the kitchen again. One memory stood out sharp as glass. The summer after I graduated high school, Dad threw a barbecue. Relatives crowded the backyard, drinking light beer and playing horseshoes. He decided it was a good time to announce his hopes for the girls. He pointed at Sophia in her sundress. This one's going to be the pride of the family. Then he gestured at me, in my jeans and ponytail. And this one thinks she's going to be a Marine. We'll see how long that lasts. The laughter that followed stuck with me longer than the smell of the grill. I went upstairs that night, slammed my bedroom door, and promised myself I wouldn't just last, I'd outlast. But family ridicule has a way of muting victories. I still remember the first time I passed a grueling field test at OCS, covered in mud, lungs burning. My drill instructor barked, "Grant, you're tougher than you look," and for 1 second, I felt invincible. Then I came home on leave, and Dad looked me over like I was playing dress-up. "You'll probably wash out before the year's over," he said, not even glancing at my new bars. Sophia laughed, sipping a Diet Coke. I never told them when I pinned on Captain. I never told them about my first deployment, or the night I flew through tracer fire to protect a convoy. What was the point? If I called home, they'd hear what they wanted anyway. So I stopped calling. Now, years later, here I was, a colonel at my sister's wedding, and the same narrative was still alive and well. She'd made sure of it. Every dig from Dad was amplified by her silence, by that smug little smirk she wore whenever he cut me down. She didn't need to say the words anymore. She'd already said them enough to brand them into me. You'll never make it. You don't belong. The clinking glasses around the hall brought me back to the present. Guests were finishing Dad's toast, smiling at Sophia and Daniel, looking everywhere but at me. The sound was polished and polite, but in my head it was the same backyard laughter from years ago, recycled and louder. I shifted in my chair and exhaled slowly, trying to keep my face neutral. My chest ached, not from shame anymore, but from restraint. I'd spent a lifetime swallowing my father's opinions, and Sophia's echoes, just to keep the peace. That was the family rule, don't rock the boat, even when the boat is sinking under the weight of his ego. But as I looked across the room at Sophia, her perfect gown, her perfect smile, I couldn't help thinking how different our paths had been. She followed the script Dad wrote for her. I tore mine up. And somehow, I was still the one painted as a failure. The irony was sharp enough to taste. I'd led Marines through combat zones. I'd made decisions with lives on the line. I'd stood in briefing rooms full of generals. But in this room? In this family? I was the punchline to an old joke that refused to die. And the thing about old jokes is, eventually, they stop being funny. The chatter in the reception hall faded into the background as I stared at the untouched glass of wine in front of me. My mind went to a different kind of noise: boots pounding against pavement, the sharp bark of orders, the clatter of gear as recruits scrambled to line up at dawn. That was the sound of OCS, the very place Dad swore I'd never survive. I still remember the first day I reported. South Carolina humidity stuck to my skin like glue, my uniform already soaked before sunrise. The instructors wasted no time tearing us down, voices blasting in our ears about how we'd never make it. It was exactly the kind of environment Dad had told everyone I couldn't handle. Every run, every drill, every hour of exhaustion, I heard his laugh in my head. But I didn't break. I pushed harder. I passed every test, pulled myself over walls that shredded the skin off my palms, carried packs so heavy they bruised my shoulders. When others collapsed in the dirt, I kept going. And at the end of those brutal weeks, I stood with my class and earned my commission. I sent a photo home in my new bars, still green in the eyes but proud. Dad never called. Mom sent a short note, "Your father's busy, congratulations." Sophia texted a smiley face, nothing more. It was like my achievement didn't fit their family script, so they ignored it. My first assignment took me to Iraq. The airfield was nothing like the glossy brochures. It was dirt, dust, and the constant roar of generators. I learned quickly that flying wasn't glamorous, it was survival. Every sortie meant calculating fuel, weather, enemy positions, and still knowing anything could change in a second. One night, our unit got called to provide cover for a convoy pinned down outside Fallujah. We scrambled, strapped in, and took off under red alert. The sky was black, broken only by tracer fire cutting through the night. I dropped into formation, voice steady over comms even as my pulse hammered. When we broke through enemy fire and secured that convoy, the relief in the radio chatter was something I'll never forget. I earned my first medal after that mission. Dad's response, when he finally heard through a distant cousin, was dismissive. "They hand those out all the time," he told relatives at a family barbecue. Sophia, standing nearby, nodded along. When Afghanistan came, the tempo only increased. Kandahar was dust storms, makeshift barracks, and constant tension. We rotated sorties, sometimes sleeping only a couple hours between missions. There was one day we lost an engine mid-flight. I had to nurse the bird back to base while my co-pilot prayed under his breath. We landed hard, sparks flying, and the ground crew rushed in like we'd just cheated death. My hands shook for hours afterward, but I didn't let anyone see. That deployment left scars I don't talk about. We lost people. We made calls that haunted us later. And through it all, I kept hearing the voice from my past. "She can't hack military life." Funny thing was, I was hacking it every damn day, in places my dad wouldn't last a minute. When I was promoted to major, I tried one more time to bridge the gap. I sent a letter home, telling them about the ceremony, about the Marines who stood beside me, about the honor of pinning on new rank. No one came. No reply from Dad. The silence was louder than any battlefield I'd flown over. That was when I decided to stop sharing. If my family wanted to believe I was pushing papers, let them. It was easier than handing them truth only to watch them tear it down. By the time I made colonel, I didn't even bother mentioning it. My name was on rosters, my signature on briefings, my decisions shaping missions, but in my father's living room, I was still the kid who couldn't hack it. And now, here I was, at my sister's wedding, a room full of relatives laughing at the same old story. They didn't know about Iraq. They didn't know about Afghanistan. They didn't know about the nights I'd sat in a ready room, helmet in hand, wondering if I'd come back. They didn't know about the Marines who'd slapped me on the back after a mission, calling me the best damn pilot they'd ever flown with. They didn't know, because I never told them. And maybe that was the cruelest part, my silence gave their lies room to grow. Across the hall, Sophia leaned close to a bridesmaid, whispering something that made them both laugh. The bridesmaid's eyes flicked toward me, then away quickly, same script, different cast. I sat straighter, resisting the urge to roll my eyes. Dad had the microphone again, warming up for another story. Guests leaned in, eager for whatever punchline he'd deliver. But I didn't move. I'd spent too many years moving. Tonight, I stayed put, every muscle steady, letting them think what they wanted while I held the truth they couldn't touch. The hum of conversation around the tables turned sharper, like a swarm of bees moving from one corner of the hall to the next. I didn't need to lean in to catch the words they carried just fine across the clink of silverware. "She never finished officer training," one cousin said, loud enough to make sure I'd hear. Didn't she wash out in the first year? An aunt shook her head knowingly. Richard told us she barely made it past the first week, poor thing. At least she's got that desk job. Desk job. That phrase had followed me for years, like a sticky label slapped on my back. The same people who'd never set foot on a base were suddenly experts on what Marines did. I kept my eyes on my plate, though I wasn't eating. The chicken breast and asparagus might as well have been plastic. Sophia laughed at something, one of her bridesmaids whispered, then glanced toward me. Her lips curled into that familiar smirk. She didn't have to say anything. That look was enough to remind me she'd been the one repeating Dad's stories for years. She hadn't corrected him once, not even when he twisted half-truths into straight-up lies. Another uncle chimed in. I remember Richard saying she wanted to be a pilot, but they didn't let women fly combat. His wife corrected him, shaking her head. No, she failed the exams, that's why she pushes papers now. The fact that they were all wrong didn't matter. In their world, Dad's word was law, and Sophia's silence made it gospel. I reached for my glass of water and noticed my hand trembling. Not from fear, those days were long gone, but from the sheer weight of biting my tongue. I'd flown through tracer fire without flinching, yet here I was in a banquet hall in South Carolina, shaking because relatives couldn't keep their mouths shut. Daniel shifted in his chair at the head table. His eyes landed on me again, brow furrowed like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. The man had been in enough briefings with me to know better, but clearly, he hadn't realized my family had turned me into their favorite running gag. Did you hear what Richard said earlier? A distant cousin leaned across his table, voice dropping into fake sympathy. He said Rebecca tried officer school but couldn't hack it. It must be so hard for him, having one daughter succeed and the other just floating. Floating, I wanted to laugh. Floating was the last thing I'd ever done. I'd clawed for every step in the Corps, sweated through every exam, earned every bar, and flown every mission. Floating was what my sister did, carried by Dad's favoritism and family approval. The whispers circled closer, bouncing from table to table until they weren't whispers anymore. They were the soundtrack of the night, underscored by the jazz band in the corner. I set my fork down, too tight in the grip to keep using it. If I spoke now, it would come out sharp enough to slice the linens. I forced my hands flat on the table instead, letting the chatter roll over me. Across the hall, Sophia leaned in to kiss Daniel's cheek, but even from here, I could tell his jaw had gone rigid. He wasn't laughing, he wasn't smiling. His eyes flicked to me again, like he was calculating something. A bridesmaid brushed past my chair, perfume trailing. She leaned down just enough to murmur, "Don't let it get to you, families are cruel sometimes." She smiled politely and walked off before I could answer. Cruel was one word for it. Consistent was another. This wasn't new, this was just the encore to a play I'd been watching since childhood. Dad spoke, Sophia backed him, and everyone else nodded along. It didn't matter what I'd achieved outside these walls inside, I was still the family disappointment. The jazz band switched to a louder tune, but the gossip didn't stop. I caught a groomsman asking another, "So is she like a secretary at the base or something?" His buddy shrugged. That's what her dad said. The urge to stand up, slam my glass down, and unload the truth right there in the middle of the hall burned hotter than the wine I hadn't touched. But I stayed put. Years in uniform had taught me when to hold the line. Losing my temper here would only prove their point. Instead, I sat straighter, folded my napkin neatly, and met Sophia's eyes across the room. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. Her smirk deepened like she'd already won. But I'd seen this battlefield before, and the thing about whispers, they never last as long as facts. The facts were still mine, waiting. The air in the reception hall had grown heavy, thick with perfume, wine, and whispers that clung like smoke. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the polished floor, and slipped out a side door before anyone could stop me. Cool night air hit my face, sharp with the scent of the river. The muffled jazz and laughter inside dulled as the door shut behind me. For the first time that evening, I could breathe without feeling everyone's eyes on me. I leaned against the railing of the patio, staring out over the Charleston skyline. Lights shimmered on the water, reflections shaking with every ripple. My hands unclenched slowly, leaving crescent marks where my nails had dug into my palms. The door creaked again, and footsteps followed. I didn't turn. I figured it was a drunk cousin coming out for a smoke or one of Sophia's bridesmaids needing a breath. Ma'am. That single word froze me harder than the river air. No cousin spoke like that. I turned, and there he was. Daniel, the groom, still in his dress blues, shoulders squared, face serious. I narrowed my eyes. Excuse me? Permission to speak, Colonel? He said softly, keeping his voice low so it didn't carry inside. My heart jolted. He knew. I straightened automatically, instinct from years of uniform and rank. How do you know that? His jaw flexed. I'm Major Brooks. Stationed at Cherry Point. I've been in your AirOps briefings for the past year. I didn't place you at first, out of uniform, but when your dad said your name, he shook his head, it clicked. I stared at him, caught between disbelief and irritation. Keep your voice down. He took a half step closer, his voice dropping further. Does your family not know? No, I said flatly. And I'd like to keep it that way. He blinked like I'd just spoken in another language. You command Marines, you've led combat missions. Why would you hide that? I turned back to the river, gripping the railing hard enough to sting. Because it doesn't matter to them. It never has. Inside, the music shifted again, another round of laughter spilling through the glass before fading. Daniel stayed quiet for a beat, the silence hanging heavy. I don't understand, he finally said. You've earned more than most of us ever will. Navy Cross, Silver Stars, Squadron Command, I mean, ma'am, your pilots worship you. And yet they think you push papers? His disbelief carried more sting than the gossip. I exhaled through my nose. When I graduated OCS, Dad said it was luck. When I made captain, he said women couldn't handle combat roles. When I earned my wings, he called it a handout. You see a pattern? Daniel frowned. That's not just dismissive, that's willful. Welcome to my family, I muttered. He paced once, boots clicking on the patio stone. With all due respect, ma'am, this is insane. I can't sit through that dinner and listen to people talk about you like you're a clerk. You will, I cut in, sharp. Because this is Sophia's night, not mine. You blow this open, you embarrass her, and she doesn't deserve that. Not tonight. His brow furrowed, but he nodded once, the way Marines do when they're biting down on orders they don't like. I softened slightly. Daniel, you're marrying into this family. You'll learn quickly Dad likes his stories neat. Heroes and failures. Sophia gets the spotlight, I get the punchline. That's how it's always been. He leaned on the railing beside me, still shaking his head. That doesn't make it right. No, I admitted. But fighting him tonight would only prove his point. We stood in silence, watching the dark water. My reflection in the glass door was a stranger black dress, hair pinned up, not the colonel he'd recognized. That was the whole problem, wasn't it? Out of uniform, I was invisible. Behind us, voices grew louder, another toast underway. Daniel straightened. They don't deserve your silence. They don't deserve my truth either, I said, low but firm. They wouldn't know what to do with it. For a long second, he studied me, jaw tight, eyes narrowed. Then he gave a small, reluctant nod, the kind Marines give when they know the fight isn't theirs to win. Understood, ma'am. He adjusted his jacket and started back toward the door. Before stepping inside, he glanced over his shoulder. But one way or another, they're going to find out. The door closed, the sound of jazz and laughter rushing back before fading again. I stayed on the patio, fingers curled around the railing, knowing he was right. The lies could only stretch so far before snapping. Inside, the noise swelled, clinking glasses, bursts of laughter, the steady hum of voices repeating the same stories over and over. My father's voice rose above them all, carrying through the glass, shaping the narrative the room was eager to believe. And for the first time all night, I let myself smile, small and bitter, because Daniel wasn't wrong. Truth had a way of slipping in, no matter how many doors you tried to close. I slipped back into the reception hall, the door shutting softly behind me, the warmth hit like a wall perfume, wine, the smell of roast chicken still clinging to the air. Jazz hummed low in the corner, and the chatter picked up where I'd left it. I sat down at my table, folded my napkin neatly, and kept my expression steady. The stories were still circling. An aunt leaned toward her husband, voice loud enough for 3 tables. Richard says she flunked out. It must have been humiliating. Her husband nodded sagely, like he'd been there at OCS watching me collapse on the obstacle course. That's what I heard too. She barely made it through the first week. Now she files forms and calls it service. Another cousin chimed in. Well, at least she's drawing a paycheck. Beats moving back in with your parents. The laughter that followed was sharper this time, fueled by wine and Dad's approval. They didn't whisper anymore, they didn't have to. Dad had already given them permission to laugh. At the head table, Richard leaned back in his chair, proud as a man who thought he'd proven a point. His arm was draped around Sophia's chair, his grin wide as he told the guests beside him, "We're just grateful one of our girls chose the right path." Sophia didn't object. She never did. She sipped champagne, eyes darting toward me with something between guilt and satisfaction. I kept my posture straight, hands resting lightly on the table, the way years of briefings had trained me. Outwardly calm, inwardly a storm. Daniel sat stiffly, jaw tight, eyes scanning between me and his new father-in-law. He hadn't said anything since our talk outside, but his silence was different from mine. His was laced with tension, the kind that builds before someone stands up and makes a scene. A cousin leaned closer, pretending sympathy. "Rebecca, don't let it get to you. Not everyone's cut out for the Marines." I looked at him evenly. "You're right. Not everyone island." Then. He blinked, unsure if I agreed with him or insulted him. He turned back to his drink. The chatter moved on, but the sting didn't. Every comment was a reminder that my truth lived outside this room, and their version of me had become the only one they believed. My father's voice was their gospel, and Sophia's silence was the hymn that backed it up. I thought about the medals tucked away in my dresser back home, the flight logs, the commendations, the photos of my squadrons. None of it mattered here. Here, I was still the girl who couldn't hack it. One of the bridesmaids leaned in across her table, stage whispering to another. "She's quiet. Probably embarrassed." I mean, if my dad said that about me, I'd crawl under the table. The other girl giggled. "Maybe that's why she's sitting all the way in the corner." I took a sip of water, steady, unbothered on the surface. Inside, I catalogued every word. Silence was my shield tonight. If I spoke, I'd give them more fuel. If I stayed quiet, at least I kept control. But the silence didn't go unnoticed. Daniel's eyes flicked to me again, sharp, assessing. He clenched his jaw and set his fork down like he couldn't force another bite. His hand twitched once against the tablecloth, as if fighting the urge to pound a fist against it. I knew that look. Marines don't handle injustice well, especially when it's laid out in front of them. Dad launched into another story, his voice carrying above the band. "Sophia always had the brains, the drive, we knew she'd make us proud. Rebecca." He chuckled and shook his head for effect. "Well, she tried, let's give her that." The room chuckled with him, a chorus of polite cruelty. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs, nails digging into the fabric of my dress. Years of training told me to hold the line, keep my bearing, let the storm blow over. But part of me wondered why I was still giving this man so much power. Across the room, Sophia clinked her glass with one of the bridesmaids, both of them laughing at some private joke. She didn't look at me this time, she didn't have to. The jazz band shifted into another upbeat number, but the mood at the tables was already set. My father's version of the truth had been accepted without question. Every laugh was another nail in the coffin of the person they thought I was. Daniel shifted again, leaning forward now, his expression hard. His silence wasn't going to last much longer. And for the first time that night, I wasn't sure I wanted it to. The scrape of a chair broke through the buzz of voices. I looked up, startled, as Daniel pushed himself to his feet at the head table. The clinking of silverware slowed. A few guests glanced over, expecting another toast or maybe a harmless joke. But the look on his face wasn't one of celebration. His jaw was set, his eyes locked straight across the room at me. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel began, his voice carrying over the music until the band quieted themselves, "there's something that needs to be said." My stomach tightened. This wasn't his fight. I wanted to shake my head, signal him to sit down, but his posture was already too rigid, his decision already made. He gestured in my direction. "You've all been told tonight that Rebecca couldn't hack military life. That she failed out, that she files paperwork. That is false. And I won't sit here while her reputation is dragged through the mud." The room froze. Forks hovered midair. A bridesmaid nearly dropped her champagne glass. At our table, my father's expression snapped from smug to confused rage in an instant. "What are you doing, Daniel?" His voice cut low, but it carried. Daniel didn't flinch. He straightened to full height, chest broad in his dress blues. "I know who she island. Colonel Rebecca Grant. United States Marine Corps. She didn't fail out of officer training. She graduated, deployed, commanded squadrons, and led Marines through combat zones." Gasps rolled through the room, people craned their necks, staring at me like they were seeing me for the first time. My hands curled around the edge of the table. Heat surged up my neck, not embarrassment this time but something sharper, harder. Years of silence, and now the truth was out, not from me, but from the man my father had just praised as the pride of the family. Dad slammed his hand down on the table. "Enough." His face flushed red. "This is Sophia's wedding, not some military briefing." Sophia's eyes darted wildly between her new husband and our father, panic flickering across her perfect smile. She whispered something under her breath, but Daniel ignored her. He wasn't finished. "I've been in her briefings at Cherry Point," he said, voice steady. "I've watched Marines stand at attention when she walked in. I've heard pilots call her the reason they made it home. So if anyone here thinks she's a clerk, you're dead wrong." The hall went silent. The kind of silence that presses against your skin. Every eye on me, wide, searching, questioning. An uncle coughed awkwardly. "Wait, Colonel, did he say Colonel?" Another guest whispered, "She's been in combat?" But Richard said. The whispers began to crumble, unraveling the fabric of Dad's carefully spun story. Richard rose now, voice booming. "That's enough, Daniel. Sit down. I won't have you embarrassing my family with this nonsense." Daniel squared his shoulders. "With respect, sir, the only embarrassment here is pretending Colonel Grant is anything less than what she island." And the words hit the room like live rounds. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others leaned forward, eager for the drama. At the far table, one of Daniel's fellow officers, clearly a guest from his side of the aisle, nodded and said firmly, "He's right, everyone in the Corps knows her record." Mouths dropped. Chairs creaked as people turned to stare at me. I sat still, spine straight, face neutral, letting it all unfold. My silence, for once, wasn't weakness, it was control. Sophia stood abruptly, clutching her bouquet tighter. "Daniel, please," she hissed. "This isn't the time." He looked at her, then at me, then back to the crowd. His voice softened but didn't falter. "You all deserve the truth. And she deserves your respect." The weight of his salute came before I could stop it. He turned toward me, heels clicking together, hands snapping up sharp to his brow. "Colonel." The gesture cut the room in half. Some gasped, some clapped instinctively, others just stared in stunned silence. My heart pounded. I hadn't been saluted outside of uniform in years, not like this, not with 100 pairs of eyes locked on the exchange. Dad's face went pale, then red again, his fury boiling. Sophia's hand trembled around Daniel's sleeve, begging him to sit. But Daniel stayed standing, arm rigid in respect. It was the one thing my father couldn't spin. A salute is unmistakable, it speaks louder than words. And in that instant, I knew the night had shifted. The story wasn't his anymore. The salute froze the entire hall. For a beat, no one even breathed. Glasses hovered midair, forks paused halfway to mouths. The band in the corner stopped mid-note, horns and strings fading into silence. All that remained was the sound of my father's ragged breathing as his jaw clenched tight. I didn't move. Years of discipline kept me in place, shoulders square, eyes steady. But inside, every nerve fired with the weight of the moment. Daniel's arm held firm at his brow, a salute that didn't waver under the scrutiny of 100 guests. My uncle broke first. "Colonel," he muttered, looking around like someone would correct him. Did he just call her Colonel? One of Daniel's officer friends, seated a few tables over, spoke clearly enough for the room to hear. "That's right, Colonel Grant, everyone at Cherry Point knows her." A ripple spread through the crowd. The cousin who'd joked about me pushing papers stared wide-eyed, his smirk gone. An aunt put a hand over her mouth. The bridesmaids exchanged looks, their earlier whispers collapsing under the weight of fact. Richard slammed his glass down so hard it rattled the table. "This is absurd," he snapped. "Rebecca never made it through officer training. She couldn't handle it, I've said that for years." Daniel lowered his salute slowly, his voice cutting back through the stunned air. "With respect, sir, you've been wrong for years. I was in her briefings, I've seen her lead. Marines stand when she enters a room, she commands authority you can't fake." The hall buzzed again, louder this time. Guests leaned toward each other, murmuring, questioning. Some looked at me with awe, others with guilt. I finally spoke, my voice calm, even. "You all believed him because it was easier than asking me." Heads swiveled, no one laughed now. Sophia stood at the head table, bouquet trembling in her hand. "Rebecca, why didn't you say anything? All this time why let us think?" Her words faltered under the weight of her own silence over the years. I met her gaze evenly. "Because every time I tried, Dad told me it didn't matter." "And you nodded along." The bridesmaid beside her shifted uncomfortably. The truth was spreading faster than any rumor ever had. Another officer guest spoke up from the back. "She flew Harriers in Iraq and Afghanistan, ask anyone in Marine aviation, her name is known." The room gasped again. Someone whispered, "She was in combat?" Another voice answered, "Colonel, not a clerk." Richard's face turned crimson. He jabbed a finger in my direction. "This is a wedding, not a war story. Sit down, Rebecca. Don't ruin your sister's night with your—" Daniel cut him off, tone sharp. "Sir, she hasn't said a word, you're the one who's been ruining it." End of. The bluntness landed like a slap. The chatter spiked, guests turning fully toward the head table now. Richard's authority, usually unquestioned, was cracking in real time. Sophia's eyes brimmed with tears. She set the bouquet on the table with a shaky hand. "Dad, if she's really a colonel, if she's really done all this, how could you keep saying otherwise?" He sputtered. "Because it's not what I wanted for her, I wanted stability, I wanted her safe." No, I interrupted, my voice firm. "You wanted a story you could control. Heroes and failures." Sophia got the spotlight, I got the punchline, "That's the story you chose to tell." A murmur of agreement rippled across the hall. People who'd been laughing earlier now looked ashamed. Some lowered their eyes. Others turned toward Richard, waiting for his answer. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His bluster finally hit a wall of undeniable fact, and everyone knew it. Daniel stepped closer to the microphone, his gaze sweeping the room. "Colonel Grant is not a failure, she's not a clerk, she's a Marine officer who's earned the respect of people who've put their lives in her hands, that's not up for debate." Silence followed. Thick, charged silence. The kind that doesn't feel empty but brimming, like everyone's waiting for the ground to shift. Sophia sat down slowly, her hands trembling in her lap. The smirk she'd worn all night was gone, replaced by something raw: guilt, shame, maybe regret. I stayed still, letting the weight of the moment settle. For years, my truth had been buried under their laughter. Now, with one salute and a few words, the lies were unraveling in front of all of them. No one laughed anymore. Not one. The silence in the hall cracked under the weight of my father's breathing. His fists clenched, knuckles white against the linen tablecloth, like he could squeeze the truth back into submission. But the looks from the guests told him that trick wouldn't work anymore. He rose slowly, pushing his chair back with a screech that made every head turn. His voice shook with anger, but there was something else too: fear. "Rebecca," he said, his finger stabbing the air, "is it true? Did you really command Marines?" I met his eyes. Calm. Steady. "Yes. Nye." The word hung in the air, heavier than any toast he'd ever given. Murmurs rippled across the room. People leaned in, whispering questions that had no answers he could spin. My uncle, the same one who had laughed earlier, blinked hard. "She's a colonel?" His wife elbowed him. "You heard the man. Colonel." Richard's face contorted, confusion bleeding into disbelief. "You should have told us." "No," I corrected him, my tone sharp enough to cut through the noise. "You should have asked." "This." The crowd stirred again, heads turning from him to me and back like a tennis match. The foundation of his authority, the easy mockery, the control of the family story was splintering in front of them. Sophia stood, bouquet abandoned on the table, her lips pressed tight, her eyes glossed with tears as she looked at me, then at our father. "Rebecca," she whispered, her voice cracking, "why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell us what you've done?" I shook my head. "Would you have believed me?" Her mouth opened, then shut again. She didn't answer because we both knew the truth. I kept going. "When I graduated OCS, Dad said it was luck. When I made captain, he said women couldn't handle combat roles. When I earned my wings, he called it a handout. Every time I tried to share, he turned it into a joke. And you?" I locked eyes with Sophia. "You laughed with him. You told your friends I'd wash out, you told everyone I couldn't hack it. Lev." Sophia's tears spilled, streaking her perfect makeup. She shook her head weakly. "I didn't mean." "Yes, you did." I cut in. My voice was calm, not cruel, but there was no cushioning it. "You believed him because it was easier than standing up for me. You wanted to stay his favorite, so you nodded along while he tore me down. That's not an accident. That's a choice." Gasps scattered through the room. Guests who had once smirked now stared, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The shame was no longer mine, it was theirs. Richard's face went pale. "Rebecca, I thought." "You assumed," I said firmly. "You assumed I failed. You assumed I couldn't handle it. And you liked that story better than the truth." The hall was so quiet now, the sound of ice clinking in someone's glass carried like a bell. A cousin muttered, almost to himself, "All these years, we thought." Daniel stood at attention beside the head table, his jaw tight, his presence unyielding. He didn't add a word, didn't need to. His silence was an endorsement, a confirmation that everything I said was fact. Sophia's knees buckled, and she sank back into her chair, face buried in her hands. The weight of her complicity was finally settling. I straightened in my seat, spine tall, voice even. "You didn't ask. You didn't listen. You all chose the easier story. And you all sat here tonight, laughing at me, because it was more comfortable than facing the truth." "Aloof." One of the bridesmaids wiped her eyes. A cousin stared at the floor. My aunt clutched her husband's arm, her smug certainty gone. Richard swallowed hard, his bravado collapsing under the eyes of his own family. "Rebecca," he said hoarsely, I raised a hand, stopping him cold. "Don't bother with excuses. You spent 20 years writing my story for me. Tonight, you don't get to hold the pen." No one moved, no one dared speak. The only sound was the faint buzz of the lights overhead and the band in the corner, frozen mid-set, waiting for a cue that never came. For the first time in my life, the room wasn't laughing at me, they were listening. The room hung on the edge of every breath. My father's hand trembled where it gripped the back of his chair. His face, flushed from wine and outrage, seemed smaller than I'd ever seen it. For years, he'd been the loudest voice in every room, but now the silence pressed harder than any speech he could muster. Someone finally spoke, a cousin who'd been smirking all night. "Rebecca, is it true? You really commanded Marines?" I turned toward him. I didn't just command Marines, I was responsible for their lives. For every mission we flew. For every Marine who made it home. The weight in my voice cracked through the veneer of doubt that had coated the hall. People leaned forward, drawn in by the certainty they couldn't ignore. I let the facts come, clean and sharp. I graduated OCS, I earned my wings, I flew Harriers in Iraq and Afghanistan. I led combat sorties when convoys were pinned down and needed air cover. I've logged more hours in combat than most people here have spent at their jobs. Gasps dotted the room. A bridesmaid whispered. She flew jets? And the words carried, breaking the stunned quiet like ripples. My uncle, the one who had loudly declared I failed out, sank back in his chair, avoiding my eyes. His wife, who had repeated Dad's stories for years, looked away, her cheeks burning red. I kept going, my voice steady but not raised. When my squadron lost an engine mid-flight, I landed the bird with fire coming off the fuselage. When others froze under pressure, I made calls that kept Marines alive. That's my record. That's my life. And yet every time I came home, this family chose to laugh at me instead. Murmurs turned to shameful silence. The people who had chuckled minutes before now stared at their plates. My father tried to rally. Medals and stories don't change the fact that you abandoned your family. You never came home. I faced him squarely. I stopped coming home because home was the only place where none of it mattered. You dismissed every success as luck, every promotion as charity. You told anyone who would listen that I failed. You wanted Sophia to shine, and you decided the easiest way was to cast me as the failure. You built your story, Dad. And everyone here believed it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. An aunt muttered, "We just trusted what Richard said." Daniel stepped closer to me, his hand resting on the back of his chair. His voice carried, firm. I was in those briefings. I watched Marines stand straighter when she walked in. I've seen her make decisions under fire that most men twice her age couldn't handle. That's not a rumor. That's not family bias. That's fact. One of Daniel's officer friends at the back added, "She's respected across the Corps, everyone knows Colonel Grant." All eyes snapped back to my father. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The authority he'd wielded for decades had evaporated. Sophia, pale and trembling, finally spoke. "Dad, we've been wrong." Her voice cracked, but the words rang clear. All of us. We made jokes, we repeated lies, and she let us because we never cared enough to ask. Tears slipped down her cheeks, she pressed her bouquet to her chest like it could anchor her. The hall shifted. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. A cousin muttered. I laughed too. Another said, "I didn't know, I should have asked." I drew a breath, steady. That's the point, none of you asked. You decided the easier story was the true one. Dad got to play the proud father of Sophia while pretending I was the disappointment. And all of you went along with it. You let his version of me erase the real one. The words landed with the precision of a strike. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The truth had gutted the lies, and there was nothing left to hide behind. My father's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. I thought I was protecting you, he muttered weakly, keeping you safe. No, I said, firm. You were protecting your story. Safe doesn't look like flying combat missions, safe doesn't earn a Navy Cross. I was never safe, and I never wanted to be. But you couldn't accept that, so you rewrote me into someone small enough for you to handle. The sting in my tone wasn't anger, it was clarity. And clarity cut sharper than rage ever could. Across the hall, the band adjusted nervously, waiting for a signal to play again, but none came. The guests sat frozen in the moment, eyes darting between me and my father. For once, he had no story to sell them. The family drama he had scripted for 2 decades was unraveling, replaced with facts that couldn't be ignored. And every face in that hall wore the same expression, the dawning realization that the failure they'd laughed at had never been me. The weight of my words still hung in the air when Daniel finally spoke again, his voice carrying steady authority. There's one more thing you should all know. Colonel Grant isn't just a respected officer, she's already on the list for Brigadier General. Her promotion is pending confirmation. The reaction was immediate. The hall erupted in shocked whispers, a mix of disbelief and awe. Chairs creaked as people leaned in closer, craning to catch every word. Someone gasped outright. "General?" one cousin blurted, eyes wide. "She's going to be a general?" Another whispered to her neighbor, "That's impossible, she's too young." Daniel didn't flinch. "It's not impossible when you've earned it." Sophia froze in her chair, bouquet sliding from her lap onto the floor, her lips parted but no sound came out. The color drained from her face as if every smug word she'd ever said about me was suddenly laid bare in front of the crowd. My father stumbled a step backward, gripping the back of his chair for balance. His mouth opened, then shut again. A general?" he muttered, his voice cracking. "You can't." "I didn't." I held his gaze, my tone calm but unyielding. "Yes, Dad. Pending confirmation. And no, you didn't know, because you never wanted to. You decided the story a long time ago that I failed, that I wasn't enough, and you kept repeating it until everyone here believed you." The words cut deeper than any medal or title. Guests shifted uncomfortably, realizing they'd played along in a lie that had spanned decades. One of Daniel's fellow officers, seated near the back, spoke up with a proud grin. "It's true, she's on the short list, ask anyone in Marine aviation. Colonel Grant is respected across the Corps, she's earned every stripe, every ribbon, every salute." The murmurs turned to awe. People who had whispered insults an hour ago now stared at me like I was someone they'd never known. For once, they were right, I wasn't who they thought I was. Sophia finally found her voice, trembling. "Rebecca, you're going to be a general?" Her words cracked like glass. The tears that had been threatening finally spilled, streaking down her cheeks. She looked at me with a mixture of regret and shame, her perfect wedding makeup smudged under the weight of her own guilt. I didn't soften. "Yes. And you, of all people, should have known better. You heard Dad's lies and you repeated them. You carried them into every conversation, every whisper, every smirk. You didn't just let the story spread, you spread it yourself." She buried her face in her hands, shaking, while the room sat in tense silence. My father's eyes glistened now, though whether it was from shame or shock, I couldn't tell. His voice cracked, stripped of its booming bravado. "Rebecca. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." I answered without hesitation. "You didn't want to know, that's the difference. When I sent letters home, you ignored them. When I came back on leave, you waved off my bars like they didn't matter. You had every chance to know me, Dad. You chose not to." The guests looked at him now, not me, their judgment heavy in their stares. For the first time, it wasn't me on trial. It was him. Sophia whispered something, her voice muffled by her hands. "I thought I was protecting myself. I didn't want to believe you could do it, because that meant I wasn't the golden one anymore." The honesty stung, but at least it was finally spoken aloud. Daniel stood tall, his presence unshakable. "There's nothing left to debate. Colonel Grant has led Marines into combat, and is about to pin on a star. That's not hearsay. That's fact." The room absorbed it in silence. The same relatives who had laughed now sat stunned, eyes darting between me and my father. A bridesmaid who had whispered cruel jokes earlier now wiped at her eyes, clearly embarrassed. Even the band stayed frozen, instruments in hand, unwilling to break the tension with music. I let the silence stretch, the truth pressing down on every corner of the hall. No one dared look at me with pity anymore. No one chuckled. The balance had shifted, and they knew it. My father's shoulders sagged, his booming confidence replaced with something smaller, weaker. He whispered, "All these years, I thought I knew who you were." I met his eyes, steady. "You never asked." The room stayed hushed, every guest leaning on the edge of their seat, waiting for what came next. The hall had gone so still that the clink of a single glass echoed like a bell. My father's face, red from anger only minutes earlier, was drained now, his lips trembling as if the words he wanted wouldn't come. He finally forced them out, his voice hoarse. Rebecca, can I come to the ceremony? Your promotion. If you're really going to be a general, I want to be there. The request hit me like a blunt force. Not because it mattered, but because of the timing. 20 years of dismissal, and now he wanted a seat at the table the second there was glory to claim. I held his gaze, calm, unmoving. You want to stand in the room, clap your hands, and pretend you were part of this all along? That's not what I need from you. No. He flinched, his chest rising and falling heavily. Then what do you need? Tell me, I'll do it. I'm your father. I just want a chance to make it right. I let the silence linger until every ear in the hall leaned in, then I spoke. Start by listening, stop rewriting me into the daughter you wanted, and start seeing the one who's been here the whole time. The words struck deeper than I expected. His shoulders sagged like the air had gone out of him. For once, there was no comeback, no bark of authority. Just silence. Across the table, Sophia wiped at her face, her voice breaking. Rebecca. I don't know what to say. I believed him. I repeated it. You made a choice, I cut in, not unkindly but with no room for excuses. You stood by him because it was easier than standing by me. You wanted to protect your spot as the golden child, and it worked. You got the spotlight. I got the shame. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She nodded, too choked to answer. A murmur rippled through the guests, shame thick in the air. The same relatives who had laughed earlier now shifted uncomfortably, unable to look at me. Daniel broke the tension with a steady voice. Colonel Grant doesn't need applause, she has the respect of Marines who followed her into combat. That respect was earned with blood, sweat, and decisions most people in this room will never understand. My father turned to him, desperate. But I'm her father. That has to mean something. I shook my head slowly. Being a father isn't about biology, it's about showing up. Asking questions. Supporting without tearing down. You had that chance, and you threw it away. His eyes glistened now, the weight of his failure plain on his face. Rebecca, I don't know how to fix this. You can't fix it in one night, I said evenly. But you can stop pretending, you can start by not turning me into a story that makes you comfortable. Lay. The words landed like a verdict. He dropped his gaze, hands gripping the chair back so tightly his knuckles turned white. Guests exchanged uneasy looks. An aunt who had always joined in Dad's laughter finally spoke, her voice small. We should have asked you ourselves. We should have known better. I gave her a brief nod. Yes. You should have. But you didn't. The bluntness left no room for comfort. The truth wasn't about smoothing edges anymore. It was about drawing the line. Sophia reached across the table, her hand trembling. Rebecca, I don't expect forgiveness tonight, I don't want to keep being this person, I don't want to be the sister who dragged you down. I looked at her hand, then at her tear-streaked face. I didn't take it, but I didn't pull away either. That's up to you. You chose once. You can choose differently now. Her shoulders shook as she nodded, a sob escaping before she covered her face again. The room stayed quiet, the kind of silence that burns. For once, no one tried to fill it with jokes or small talk. The band in the corner sat frozen, instruments untouched. I leaned back in my chair, my voice steady. I didn't come here to be vindicated. I came to sit quietly at my sister's wedding. But when the lies started rolling again, I decided silence wasn't the shield I needed anymore. The truth is enough, it always has been. The words settled into the hall, heavy but final. My father's head dropped, his hands shaking where they gripped the chair. He had begged, but the answer wasn't his to control anymore. And everyone in the room knew it. The reception limped on, but no one really cared about the cake or the champagne anymore. Conversations had dulled to murmurs, each table buzzing with its own version of the same question. How had they all missed it? How had they believed my father's story for so long when the truth had been sitting at the edge of their family dinners, in plain sight? I didn't move. I didn't need to. For once, the silence worked for me. My family's stares weren't daggers anymore, they were confessions. The guilt in their faces was louder than any apology. My father never tried another toast. He stayed in his chair, smaller than I'd ever seen him. His glass of wine went untouched. The man who had spent decades controlling the narrative had nothing left to say. Sophia kept her distance, shoulders hunched, her perfect bridal glow stripped away. The smirk that had once been her armor was gone, replaced by eyes that finally saw me as something more than her foil. Whether she would hold on to that realization tomorrow or the day after didn't matter. Tonight, she'd been forced to see. Guests began drifting by, some awkwardly, some with genuine regret. A cousin muttered, "You deserved better from all of us." An aunt said, "I'll never laugh at one of his jokes again." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The acknowledgement was enough. Daniel, standing near the head table, caught my eye and gave a single nod. Not for the crowd, not for his bride, but for me. It was a soldier's nod, an unspoken message. "You held the line, ma'am, well done." For the first time all evening, I let myself breathe. Later, when the night wound down and guests began collecting coats, I stepped outside again. The river air was cool, brushing against my skin like a reset. Behind me, muffled voices carried through the glass doors apologies, promises, awkward laughter trying to stitch the night back together, but none of it touched me anymore. I had spent a lifetime thinking silence was my shield. Tonight, I realized it wasn't silence that protected me. It was truth. Cold, undeniable, and mine to wield. The so-called family revenge wasn't about humiliating them the way they had humiliated me. It wasn't about proving my father wrong in front of a crowd or making Sophia cry. The real revenge was forcing them to see me exactly as I was, without the filter of their lies. I thought of the Marines who had saluted me after missions, the pilots who had trusted me with their lives, the operations I'd commanded that no one in that hall could ever comprehend. Those were my real witnesses. Those were the voices that had mattered all along. Inside, I caught a glimpse through the glass. Sophia crouched near her bouquet, finally picking it up, her bridesmaids huddled close. My father sat slumped, his tie loose, his pride shattered. And my mother, silent all night, rested a hand on her glass, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The sight didn't bring me joy, it brought clarity. Family had always been my battlefield. Tonight, I hadn't fired a shot. I hadn't needed to. The truth did all the work for me. As the last guests trickled out and the band began packing their instruments, I straightened my shoulders and stepped back inside. Some offered polite goodbyes, a few stumbled over the word "Colonel," unsure if they were allowed to use it. I just nodded, letting them carry their discomfort home. Daniel approached me once more, his voice low. "I hope I didn't overstep." I shook my head. "You did what needed to be done." He smiled faintly. "For what it's worth, ma'am, the Marines at Cherry Point have your back. Always have." I gave him a rare smile in return. "Congratulations, Major, take care of Sophia." "No." His expression flickered. He knew that wasn't a blessing, but a challenge. Still, he nodded. I left before the lights came up, before anyone could try to rewrite the ending. The night wasn't about reconciliation, not really, it was about recognition. For once, the narrative wasn't theirs. It was mine. Walking out into the quiet Charleston night, I thought about what my father had asked earlier, why I hadn't fought harder against his assumptions. The answer had always been simple. You don't argue with people who don't want the truth, you don't waste breath trying to win over those who've already decided you've lost. You just climb, you soar. And when the time comes, you let your wings speak louder than their doubts ever could. That night, my wings roared not in combat, not in a briefing room, but in a wedding hall full of people who finally realized the failure had never been me. And for the first time, I didn't need their applause. I had already won. That night reminded me of something I wish I'd learned years earlier. Silence doesn't protect you, it only protects the people who want to define you. The real strength is in living your truth so loudly that no one can deny it, not even family. This wasn't about medals, or promotions, or even rank. It was about finally ending a family drama that had gone on for decades, and showing that some of the most powerful revenge stories aren't about getting even, they're about refusing to stay small. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I share stories like this because family revenge stories and military journeys carry lessons about resilience, justice, and finding your own voice. If you want more revenge stories and family drama told with honesty and grit, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear what stood out to you most.